What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. It's a little overcast and cloudy today, but we're out in the garden and that's all that matters. Hopefully you guys are having a wonderful day wherever you're at. In today's episode, we're going to talk about 5 of the most drought-resistant crops you can be adding into your garden. Let's go. All right, so just our luck for filming a drought episode. We're actually getting quite a bit of rain right now. But for the past 7 weeks, we haven't gotten hardly any rain at all. And there's been one crop that's shined above all the rest, and that's peppers. Now, peppers are a crop that loves an arid environment. In fact, they basically thrive in places like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Mexico. And that's because they like a really well-draining soil. They like a very dry soil. They like a nice, hot, low humidity, and they do very well in that environment. Now, these peppers here, they haven't even blinked. They haven't flinched. They've in fact grown and thrived during the drought, and we've hardly had to water them. I think if I had to count how many times I've watered these pepper plants over the past 7 weeks, I think I might have only watered them 3 to 5 times. So not that many times for how dry it's been, considering all the times I had to water our other crops. So these peppers are doing really, really well. And a lot of times people tend to overwater their peppers and think that they need lots of water, but in fact, they like kind of being in a drought. They like it because if you water them too much, they're going to suffer from something called pepper leaf eodema, which is where the underside of the leaf actually has these little lesions, these cells that are filled with water, and they end up rupturing, and it really actually stresses the plant out quite a bit. And then also you can suffer from things like root rot and fruit rot if they get too much water as well. And so peppers are one that loves a drought. The second most drought-tolerant crop in the garden that I could probably think of are herbs. Herbs like oregano, sage, bergamot, and tarragon. These Mediterranean herbs love an arid environment. You see this tarragon here, I have not watered it one single time the entire season, and it's taller than me. Just kidding. This thing's crazy huge though. This thing is absolutely nuts. And we've not watered it one single time, and that's because it loves that arid environment. There's also crops that I haven't mentioned, like basil and thyme as well. Those crops love those arid environments. There's so many other herbs as well that I just don't have time to mention, but there are a lot of really arid-loving crops that would not flinch if you had a drought, and in fact, they probably would do better than some of the garden conditions that we put them in. I know when I was first starting out gardening, I thought all of my plants just needed lots of water, and I ended up killing a lot of them because I thought they needed lots of water. When I stopped watering and I basically gave them a drought, they're like, whew, thank you. So grow some herbs like that, they're not gonna flinch. The third most drought-resistant crop in the garden are squash. Now I know you probably haven't given much thought to squash being a drought-resistant crop, and I didn't either until I started learning about the backstory of them and how they actually came about. You see, thousands of years ago, these crops were grown by native Indians in not only North America, but Central America and South America. Native Indians grew these crops in methods called dry farming. We did a whole video about dry farming and how they actually would build these mounds, put the seeds inside of the mound. Then during the wet season, the water would essentially flood around the mounds and irrigate the crops. And then when the water left, the crops were on their own. And so these squash have been born and bred to survive in drought-like conditions. This is a butternut squash, but there's also things like patty pan squash, crookneck squash, zucchinis. Even though they seem to be very succulent and water rich, they actually do very, very well in drought conditions. Now, not necessarily bone dry forever conditions, but a drought, right? So maybe it could be 3 to 5 weeks without any rain. They're going to do very, very well in those conditions, and that's because they've just been bred for so long to tolerate those dry conditions that they don't necessarily mind as much as some of your other crops in the garden. Now, the fourth crop is not represented here, but I think it's probably one of the most iconic drought-resistant crops, and that's corn. Now, corn, much like squash, has been grown for thousands of years as a drought-resistant crop. I mean, I don't think it's any question at all why native tribes to Central America and like lower parts of North America around Mexico and New Mexico, places like that basically made corn a staple in their diet because of that arid environment they're part of. It's a great food source, as a great carbohydrate source, and it grows so well in those drought-like conditions that essentially all you need is a wet season to get it growing really well, And then you can basically give it little spits of water here and there, and it's gonna do totally fine. Now, we don't have corn in our garden now because of the fact it's a really kind of a space hogging crop, but if we had more space, you betcha corn would be something that we'd grow, because I love growing it. I love how it looks, I love harvesting it, I love how it tastes, of course, but in our garden with the limited space that we have, I just as soon let a local farmer grow it and support them. So we don't have corn in our garden, but corn, if you have the space, is absolutely a wonderful drought-resistant crop to add to your garden. All right, the fifth and final crop is probably gonna blow your mind when you find out that this crop is drought-resistant, and I know it blew mine, and that's tomatoes. Now, I know you're probably looking at these plants and you're thinking, how are those beautiful, moisture-rich red, yellow, pink, and burgundy fruits, how are those gorgeous fruits drought-resistant? Because it seems like they would need a lot of water. And if you thought they need a lot of water, you'd be wrong. Tomatoes are very drought-resistant. Now, there are certain varieties that are gonna be more drought-resistant than others. That's kind of the fine print. That's what I want you to take from this, is that by doing your research, you can find varieties that are basically born and bred for drought-resistant conditions. And the varieties that are typically more commonly drought resistant are going to be your smaller tomatoes and your paste tomatoes. There's specifically a variety called Rio Grande, and we saw these varieties being grown down in Mexico when Cindy and I went down there to visit Cindy's family, and we talked to a couple farmers that grew them, and they practice a method like we were talking about with the squash called dry farming. And basically what they do is these farmers will plant their tomato plants in the ground in around early February. And when they plant them in the ground, they use a sheet mulching, a plastic sheet mulching, to lock in moisture in the soil. And essentially they gamble on that rain coming for the first month or so. Once the rain is in the soil and it's trapped in that mulch, what they then do is they basically let the plants go. And when we went, it was early June, and they planted in early February. And the farmer that I spoke to said that it only had rained one time since they planted in early February. So they had all of that soil moisture that was locked in, got the plants growing. Once the plants were established, it rained one other time, and that was it. And yet these plants were absolutely laden with fruit. Now, when you dry farm tomatoes, what you'll find is that the tomatoes that are meant to be dry farmed, they're very drought resistant, you'll find that they do fruit slightly less, but the quality of the fruit will be so much higher. Not only will they have more concentrated sugars, but they'll also have a longer shelf life, and they'll also have way more flavor. They'll have a much richer, deeper flavor to them. And that's just because they're growing at a much slower pace because there's not as much water that they're pulling from. Now, I know you're probably thinking, well, Luke, how come tomatoes have blossom end rot with a lack of water? It's not a lack of water, it's the inconsistent watering. You see, if the tomatoes grow with water and then don't have a lot of water, and they're a drought-resistant variety, they're simply going to continue to grow, and they may suffer from blossom end rot, but they're a lot less likely to than some of your other varieties. And I know you're probably thinking, well, what about cracking? Well, cracking occurs when you have dry conditions and then you get a lot of water and then it's dry, and then a lot of water and it's dry. It's the fruit basically expanding really quickly. Dry farming takes all of that out of the equation, because dry farming basically says, well, there's not a lot of water all at once. It's just very little water, or infrequent waterings that are very light, and they don't penetrate the soil very deep. It's just enough to kind of give the plant a little bit of water to satiate itself. It's not going to cause the fruit to just expand overnight and just start to crack. That's what causes cracking. So a lot of gardeners, they look at their tomatoes and they really misread them. Tomatoes can absolutely grow in an arid environment if you pick the right varieties. And so if you're someplace that does not get frequent rain, or you don't want to water your garden very frequently, go with some of those more drought-resistant varieties. I think you'll really find them to be quite impressive. And also, learning from people that dry farm and learning about the practice of dry farming can absolutely help you to not only pick the varieties that are going to do well, but also kind of put your worries at ease about some of these varieties. I was just blown away. I couldn't put it any other way. When we went down there, there was literally acres and acres of tomatoes that were loaded with beautiful red fruits, and they were practicing Florida weaving. And these things were just hanging over the vine, loaded with tomatoes. And I said, these tomatoes haven't been watered in 3 months? And the guy said, nope. We're just basically growing them up, and we're going to harvest them all at once, and then they're done. and that's their season. That's their tomato season. And then when the rains come, they do it all over again. And so it's such an incredible concept that tomatoes can be drought resistant. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know that talking about drought can be kind of a stressful topic because drought is seen as this really bad thing. And yeah, droughts can be a bad thing, but there can be a lot of good that can come from it. And you can still have a successful garden even in a drought. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit that like button. It helps spread these videos around. And you guys have been doing a great job of spreading our videos around. I've been blown away at the increase in viewership, not only per video, but just channel wide. It's been incredible. So please keep hitting that like button. Spread this video around to other friends. Spread this video around like wildflower seeds. Get this video out to other people that might be able to use the information. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care, everyone. Bye.